Welcome to this week's Q&A, and welcome to all the Australian expats around the world who I think will have an interest in this, because we've had it asked of us from a number of different expats living in different jurisdictions, and it's all in relation to some of the proposed changes that were mooted in this year's federal budget relating to particularly tax residency. And as we all know, a lot of expats, when they've lived offshore for a long time, might contemplate buying a home in Australia or a property in Australia, which they may potentially turn into their future main residence or their home. And we've seen a lot of that obviously in the last 12 months post-COVID. This has brought this sort of thought process, I guess, forward. And this week's question was from someone who is living in Singapore, and like the other people, they've generally speaking, been longer term expats. So they've lived offshore in different countries for quite a number of years. And this gentleman said, look, can I still buy my future home now that these tax residency changes have been mooted in this year's budget? And it's interesting to have a look at these things, because we often see this when legislation becomes proposed that's supposed to simplify things or clarify things. Quite often it actually does the opposite for quite some time, and it causes a lot of confusion and angst amongst people, and certainly amongst our Australian expat community around the world. That's what we're seeing play out at this moment. So let's just go through this, because it all relates to what's been proposed, this new 183-day bright line test. So if you spend more than 183 days in Australia, you're going to be classified an Australian tax resident. So let's see what happens after that. You want to buy your future home potentially in Australia. What happens if you don't spend the 183 days there? Well, what's been mooted is this 45-day rule. So if you tick the box to any one of 4 subtests, you'll trigger this 45-day rule, and that could be quite draconian. And let's have a look at these subtests, because one of them is that you have the right to reside in Australia permanently, or you're an Australian citizen. So every Australian citizen or every Australian expat around the world is going to tick that box regardless. So then if you go and buy a property in Australia, it doesn't matter whether it's going to be your future home or it's an investment property, because one of the other subtests is, do you have an economic interest economic interest in Australia? So if you have investment properties, you'll tick that box. And the other subtest is, do you have accommodation available to you? So let's say you went and bought this future home and didn't rent it out, but it was obviously then available to you if you went there, you would potentially tick that box. And the last one is, do you have Australian family? That relates particularly to a spouse or children under the age of 18. But in regard to this question, can you still buy your home? Yes, because if you're going to buy a property in Australia now and you're not going back there right now, it's obviously going to be an investment property from the beginning. So it will basically form part of your investments there. Yes, you will have an economic interest in Australia. Most people already do. They've either left their ex-main residence there, which they're renting out, they own other property, or they may have other economic interests within the country. So most people are going to basically fall into this category. Now, the most important thing though to remember is, it's not just what's proposed, but the fact that it really depends on which country or which jurisdiction you live in from a tax viewpoint, because Australia has many double tax agreements with countries around the world. This person came from Singapore and they have one with Singapore. So at the end of the day, what actually determines your residency, as the law does at this point in time, is where you reside. So if there's a double tax agreement in place, the tiebreaker tests come into play, and that's what determines where you actually reside at the moment. Where do you live? Do you have a permanent residence in the country that you live in? In this case, Singapore. Gentleman obviously does. His family is here, his dog's here. his home or his prior home in Australia has been rented out for many, many years. So the DTA agreement would assist in that instance, and one could argue very clearly that this person is not a tax resident of Australia. So it's not the domestic tax law that basically determines this, it's the tiebreaker test of the double tax agreement. And that's obviously a very beneficial situation because you want to have some real clarity about these things. Now let's have a look at another person that asked a similar question, and they lived in Hong Kong. Hong Kong doesn't have a double tax agreement with Australia, even though China does. So in that situation, it's a very different outcome. You know, the ground rules might remain the same, but for that person, they really have to then be very careful and count the days they're going to spend in Australia if this, and it is proposed at this stage, tax clarification comes to become legislation in the future. So it's really important to make sure that you don't look at these things and get a general appraisal of where you may or may not be. You need to get some, I think, specific advice in relation to this and be very cognizant of what it is that you're doing to make sure that you come out with the correct and most beneficial outcome for yourselves. I'm Andrew Unterweger. Reach out to us if you need any assistance, and we can certainly point you in the right direction. All the very best to all Aussie expats around the world. See you next week.